The Wyoming sky was a thing of cruel, indifferent beauty. It stretched from one jagged horizon to the other, an endless canvas of blue that offered no shade and no promises. Below it, the land was just as unforgiving. Craggy mountains, old as time itself, stood like silent, gray sentinels over plains of sagebrush and grass that rolled on for more miles than a man could ride in a week. The wind was the only constant, a ceaseless whisper that scoured the dirt, bent the sparse trees, and carried the scent of dust and distant rain. It was a land that could make a man feel impossibly small, or it could break him altogether. Elias Thorne felt like he was a bit of both. He stood in a cloud of dust, the coarse hemp of his lariat coiled loosely in one hand, the other resting on his thigh. Before him, a wild mustang, all muscle and panicked fury, bucked against the rope that held it fast to the snubbing post. Elias moved with an economy born of long practice. There was no wasted motion, no flourish. He was a man in his early 30s, built broad in the shoulder and lean in the hip, with the kind of sun-beaten skin that looked more like tanned leather than flesh. His strength was plain to see in the cabled muscles of his forearms and the solid set of his jaw, but it was his eyes that told the truer story. They were the color of a stormy sky, and in their depths was a sorrow so deep and settled it seemed a permanent part of him. He worked alone on his ranch, Thorn Creek Hollow. The deed was his, an inheritance from a father he barely remembered, but the land felt more like a prison. It held him, bound him to a past he could not escape. The hollow was nestled in a curve of the mountains, a pocket of slightly greener land fed by the creek that gave it its name. It was his world, and it was empty. The mustang finally tired, its sides heaving, its wild eyes rolling. Elias approached it slowly, murmuring low, meaningless sounds. The horse flinched but held its ground. This was a language he understood, the silent dialogue of patience and will. He could gentle a horse, break its spirit just enough to accept a saddle, without ever breaking the animal itself. It was a quiet art, and one of the few things that brought a flicker of purpose to his days. His life was a rotation of relentless, solitary tasks. When the sun rose, casting long shadows from the peaks, he was already moving. He rode the fence lines, miles of wire and wood that seemed to stretch into infinity under the relentless glare. He would find a post rotted at its base or a wire snapped by a wandering buffalo herd, and he would dismount, his tools moving with practiced efficiency. He would reset the post, his sweat mingling with the dust, his hammer blows the only sound to break the immense silence. He tended to his cattle, a small, hardy herd that foraged on the tough prairie grass. They were his livelihood, but he felt no great attachment to them. They were simply another chore, another reason to keep moving from sunrise to sunset. The silence of his life was a physical presence. It was a weight in the air of his small log cabin, a constant companion on his long rides. Sometimes the only sounds for hours would be the creak of his saddle leather, the lowing of a distant calf, or the sharp, lonely cry of a hawk circling high overhead. The world was full of noise, but none of it was meant for him. His cabin was a testament to his existence. It was made of sturdy, hand-hewn logs, the gaps chinked with mud and moss. Inside, it was sparse and impeccably clean. A simple cot stood against one wall, its wool blanket folded with military precision. A rough plank table and a single chair sat near the stone fireplace, which was swept clean even in the heat of summer. The floor was packed earth, hard as stone. There were no pictures on the walls, no carvings on the mantel, no sign that a life was truly being lived within its walls. It was a place for sleeping and eating, a shelter from the elements. Nothing more. There was only one thing that betrayed the man he had once been. Tucked away in the bottom of a small wooden chest, beneath a spare shirt and a whetstone, was a small, faded tintype. It was a portrait of a woman with a bright, hopeful smile and eyes that crinkled at the corners. In her arms, she held a swaddled infant, its face a tiny, perfect bundle. He never took it out. He did not need to. The image was burned into his memory, a ghost that walked beside him every waking moment. Sometimes, in the dead quiet of the evening, the memories would come unbidden. They were sharp and painful, slivers of a life that felt like it belonged to another man. 5 years ago, he remembered the feel of Sarah's hand in his, her skin soft against his calluses. He remembered her laughter, a sound like wind chimes, as they raised the first logs of the cabin. They had been so full of hope, their future as wide and open as the Wyoming sky. "It's our place, Elias," she had said, her head resting on his shoulder as they watched the sun set over their land. Our own piece of the world. He had believed her. He had believed that their love was strong enough to tame the harsh country, to build a life from dirt and timber and dreams. He remembered her telling him she was with child, the look of pure, unbridled joy on her face, a look that had filled the empty spaces inside him he had not even known were there. Those memories were a sweet poison, because they always led to the other one, the one that was never far from his thoughts. The winter had come in hard and fast that year, a brutal siege of snow and ice. Sarah had been near her time, and the blizzard had descended like a white devil, burying the world in a silent, suffocating blanket. The labor had started in the heart of the storm. It was long and difficult, and her strength had begun to fail. Panic, cold and sharp, had pierced the fog of his exhaustion. The nearest doctor was in Redemption, a full day's ride in good weather. In the blizzard, it was suicide. But seeing the life fade from her eyes, he knew he had no choice. He had kissed her forehead, promised her he would be back, and ridden out into the white hell. He never made it to town. His horse had gone down 3 miles from the cabin, its leg broken in a snow-drifted gully. He had shot the animal, a mercy, and tried to continue on foot. But the storm was a living thing, a monster of wind and freezing snow that drove him back. It took him a day and a night to fight his way back to the hollow. When he finally stumbled through the cabin door, half frozen and defeated, he was met with an impossible silence. The fire was dead. The cabin was cold as a tomb. Sarah was gone, and their infant son, Daniel, who had drawn only a few precious breaths in this world, was gone with her. He blamed himself. He had left her. He should have stayed. He blamed the unforgiving land, a place that gave with one hand and took everything with the other. And he listened, in his darkest moments, to the whispers he heard in town on his rare trips for supplies. The locals spoke of the thorn curse. They said the hollow was bad ground, a place where tragedy was seated in the soil. His father had died there, gored by a bull. Now his wife and son. The curse had found him, too. The tragedy had built a wall around him, stone by stone, until he was completely walled off from the world. He was a recluse, a ghost haunting his own land, and that was how he intended to stay. Yet, for all the hardness that had grown around his heart, a kernel of decency remained, buried deep. He could not scour it out, much as he sometimes tried. He was checking a section of his northern fence line when he saw the wagon. It was a homesteader's rig, dilapidated and worn, its canvas cover torn. A wheel was broken, the axle resting in the dirt. A man, thin and worried, was struggling with it, while a woman sat on the wagon tongue, holding a small child who was coughing with a dry, rattling sound. The Millers? He knew of them, though he had never spoken to them. They were new to the territory, trying to scratch a life from a hard-scrabble patch of land a few miles east of his. Elias watched them from the cover of a rocky outcrop, his face an unreadable mask. He saw the desperation in the man's movements, the fear in the woman's eyes as she looked at her sick child. His first instinct was to ride away, to leave them to their trouble. It was not his concern. The world was full of suffering, and he had enough of his own. But he stayed, watching, until the man finally gave up for the day, slumping in defeat. The next morning, before the sun had crested the mountains, Elias was gone from his cabin. He returned an hour after dawn, a young buck slung over his saddle. He dressed the deer with swift, practiced cuts, wrapping a hindquarter in burlap. He rode a wide, circuitous route, approaching the miller's camp from the downwind side, his horse's hooves making little sound on the soft earth. He dismounted 100 yards away and crept closer, silent as a shadow. He left the bundle of meat on a large, flat rock near their camp, a place where they would be sure to find it. On his way back to his horse, a heavy sack of flour, one he had purchased on his last trip to Redemption, snagged on a low branch and tore. Nearly half its contents spilled out before he could secure it. He looked down at the pile of white flour on the ground, then back toward the camp. He remounted his horse and rode away, leaving the lost flour where it lay. He did not seek thanks, did not want it. He was a protector of the weak by an instinct he could not suppress, a quiet act of humanity from a man who believed he had none left. It was a week later that he received visitors of a different sort. He saw the dust cloud long before he saw the riders. 2 men, mounted on fine, tall horses that dwarfed his own sturdy stock. He knew who they were before they were close enough to see their faces. The man in the lead was Jedediah Kane, a name that carried weight in this part of the territory. Kane owned the K-Bar, a sprawling empire of cattle and grass that consumed everything it touched. He was a man who saw the land not as a home, but as a possession, and the people on it as either tools or obstacles. The second man was Riggs, Kane's foreman, a bull of a man with a brutish face and hands like stone hammers. They reined in before his cabin, their horses stomping impatiently. Elias did not move from the porch step where he was mending a bridle. He simply watched them, his expression neutral. "Thorn," Kane said. It was not a question. His voice was smooth, but with an edge of arrogance that set Elias's teeth on edge. Kane was dressed in a fine leather vest and clean trousers, looking utterly out of place in the rustic hollow. "Jedediah Kane, I'm sure you know who I am." Elias gave a slight, non-committal nod. Kane smiled, a thin, predatory expression. "I'll get straight to it. I want your land. This little hollow of yours has the only reliable water source for 10 miles in any direction. Thorn Creek is worth more than all your scrawny cattle put together. I'm prepared to make you a fair offer, enough for you to pack up and start somewhere new, somewhere less unlucky." The last word hung in the air, a deliberate, calculated insult. Elias's eyes flickered from Kane to Riggs, who sat his horse in stony silence, his gaze flat and menacing. Elias's hand, which had been working a piece of leather, went still. "My land's not for sale," he said, his voice low and even. Kane's smile tightened. "Do not be foolish. Thorn, a man alone cannot work a spread this size, not properly. You are barely scratching by. I'm offering you a clean slate, a way out. You should take it." The offer was laced with a veiled threat, the implication clear. Refusal would have consequences. "I said, it's not for sale," Elias repeated, his voice harder this time. He stood up slowly, his full height nearly matching Kane's on horseback. He was not an imposing man in the way Riggs was, but there was a slubba, a rootedness to him that was just as formidable. Kane's condescending demeanor curdled into a sneer. He looked around at the small cabin, the modest corral, his gaze lingering for a moment on the hill behind the cabin. "They say this place is cursed," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "Bad things happen in this hollow. Maybe it would be better for everyone if you just disappeared. Let the curse run its course." Elias's hand drifted, almost unconsciously, to rest near the worn handle of the Colt Peacemaker on his hip. "You and your man are on my land. Kane, I suggest you leave it." For a long moment, the only sound was the wind whistling through the eaves of the cabin. Kane held Elias's gaze, then finally gave a short, humorless laugh. He pulled on his reins, turning his horse. "You will regret this, Thorn," he said over his shoulder. Riggs gave Elias one last cold look before following his boss. Elias watched them until they were nothing more than a speck of dust on the horizon. That evening, he did not eat. He took a worn shovel and walked up the small hill that overlooked his cabin. There, 2 simple wooden crosses stood against the darkening sky. He spent a few minutes clearing the weeds that had begun to sprout around their bases, his movements slow and deliberate. He did not speak. He did not pray. He just stood there, a silent vigil of guilt and love. This was his penance. He was a man trapped in time, reliving his greatest loss day after day, year after year. He talked to his horse, a big roan named Jasper, more than he had spoken to any person in 5 years. He would stand here until the last light faded, letting the loneliness wash over him, a familiar and deserved pain. The storm rolled in later that night, sudden and violent. Rain came down in sheets, lashing against the log walls of the cabin. Wind howled through the hollow, a mournful, angry sound. Elias sat at his table, a single lantern casting a small pool of flickering yellow light, cleaning his rifle. The storm outside was no match for the one that lived permanently inside him. That is when he heard it, a faint cry, nearly lost in the roar of the wind and rain. He froze, listening. It came again, closer this time, a sound of pain, human. His first instinct was to ignore it. It was the storm playing tricks on him. Or if it was real, it was trouble, and he wanted no part of anyone else's trouble. His cursed world was his own. He would not invite another soul into it. But the cry came a third time, weaker now, followed by a soft thud. He set the rifle down, his jaw tight, his fundamental decency, that stubborn, buried part of him, won out, cursing under his breath. He pulled on his coat, grabbed the lantern, and stepped out into the raging storm. The wind nearly tore the door from his hand. Rain soaked him instantly. He held the lantern high, its light cutting a shaky path through the darkness. He followed the sound down toward the creek, which was now a churning, muddy torrent. There, collapsed in the mud at the water's edge, was a figure, a person, soaked through, their clothes little more than rags. He knelt, turning the figure over. It was a woman. Her face was pale, her hair a dark, wet tangle across her cheeks. She was feverish to the touch, and a nasty gash on her forearm was bleeding sluggishly. The blood washed thin by the rain. She was unconscious. He hesitated for only a second. He looked from her still face back toward the dark, empty cabin that had been his sanctuary and his prison. Bringing her inside would change everything. It was an intrusion, a complication he did not want, but leaving her here to die in the storm was not something he could do. With a resigned sigh that was lost in the wind, he lifted her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected. He carried the stranger back to his cabin, the lantern swinging wildly, and laid her gently on his own bed. He had unwittingly brought the first glimmer of change into his stagnant, silent life. He had no idea that in saving her, he was taking the first step toward saving himself. He did not even know her name. He would not learn until later that she was called Lena Serrano. He moved with a clumsy gentleness that was alien to him. His hands, accustomed to the brute force required to set a fence post or the unyielding tension of a lariat, now felt large and ill-suited for the delicate task of tending to the woman on his bed. He had stripped away her wet, torn dress, his motions brisk and impersonal, and covered her with his spare wool blanket. Now, by the steady light of the lantern, he cleaned the gash on her arm. He used a clean rag and water from the bucket, his touch surprisingly light. The wound was deep, but clean of debris as far as he could tell. He applied a salve he used for his horses, a pungent mix of pine tar and herbs, and bandaged it tightly with strips torn from one of Sarah's old chemises he found in the chest. Her face, even slack in unconsciousness, was a map of hardship. There were fine lines of exhaustion around her eyes and mouth, a faded bruise high on one cheekbone, and a deep, unsettling weariness that seemed to emanate from her very bones. Her presence had fundamentally altered the space of his cabin. For 5 years, it had been his shell, an ordered, empty place where his grief could echo undisturbed. Now, it felt small, crowded. The air was thick with the scent of her, of rain and earth and fever, a forgotten sense of purpose, a flicker of something other than the monotonous rhythm of survival, stirred deep within him. It was an unwelcome and unsettling feeling. He did not sleep that night. He sat in his chair by the cold fireplace, his rifle across his lap, and watched her. He was a sentinel guarding a gate he had not asked for. The silence was different now. It was not the hollow silence of his own loneliness, but a shared quiet, punctuated by her shallow, feverish breaths. His solitude, his most cherished and painful possession, was no longer absolute. In the course of making her more comfortable, he found the pouch. It was small, made of worn, supple leather, and hung from a simple cord around her neck. He hesitated before touching it, feeling like a trespasser. But his curiosity, a long-dormant instinct, got the better of him. Inside, he found a pinch of dried, fragrant herbs he did not recognize, and a single, perfect feather. It was a deep, iridescent blue, almost black, unlike any bird he knew in this territory. It was a talisman, a piece of a life and a world utterly separate from his own. He tucked it carefully back into the pouch and laid it on her chest, a silent acknowledgement of the mystery he had brought into his home. As the night wore on and the storm outside abated, she began to murmur. She tossed her head back and forth on his pillow, her brow furrowed in distress. Her words were disjointed, fragments of a nightmare spoken in a mix of English and Spanish. He heard a name, Vicente, spoken not with affection but with a sharp, cutting fear. He heard phrases that painted a dark picture. No, por favor, de jamais en paz. And then, in a chillingly clear whisper of English, he owns the brand, he owns the soul. Her mind, freed from the constraints of consciousness, was replaying the life she had fled. It was a life in the New Mexico territory, under the thumb of a powerful patron named Vicente, a man whose generosity was a gilded cage. To him, she had been little more than property. Her mixed blood, half Mexican, half Jicarilla Apache, marking her as something to be possessed, not cherished. Her memories, sharp and visceral in the fever dream, were of his possessive gaze, his hands that could be gentle one moment and brutal the next. The final memory, the one that made her cry out in her sleep, was of a brutal beating, the one that had finally given her the courage of desperation. She had run, with nothing but the clothes on her back and the pouch around her neck, her journey north a desperate, weeks-long flight for her life. She had lived off the land, using the knowledge her mother had given her, always looking over her shoulder for the men Vicente would have surely sent after her, a bounty on her head like some stray piece of livestock. She was perpetually wary, a creature of the shadows, because prejudice had been the one constant in her entire life. Just before dawn, she awoke. Her eyes snapped open, wide and dark with terror. They focused on him, this large, bearded stranger sitting in the shadows of the cabin, and her first instinct was raw, animal fear. She scrambled to get off the bed, a strangled cry catching in her throat, but a wave of dizziness and weakness sent her collapsing back onto the cot. Elias stood up slowly, keeping his hands open and away from his body. He did not speak at first, knowing words would be useless. He moved to the small cook fire and ladled some thin broth he had made from boiled rabbit into a tin cup. He approached the bed slowly, as he would a spooked foal. He held out the cup. His actions were his only language. I will not harm you. Here is sustenance. She watched him, her breath coming in ragged pants, her body tense to fight or flee. He simply stood there, his gaze steady, until finally, her terror seemed to recede, replaced by a cautious assessment. She took the cup with a trembling hand, her eyes never leaving his face. They were two wounded animals, trapped in the same small space, each recognizing the deep hurt in the other. My name is Elias, he said, his voice rough from disuse. She drank the broth, the warmth spreading through her. "Lena," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. He nodded. He asked no more questions. He did not ask where she came from or where she was going. He could see the fear in her, and he knew that questions were a threat. He, in turn, offered nothing of his own past. The two simple wooden crosses on the hill remained his silent secret. The days that followed fell into a strange, new rhythm. Lena's strength returned slowly, a testament to a resilience that amazed him. As soon as she could stand without swaying, she insisted on earning her keep. She refused to be a burden. Elias came back from mending a fence one afternoon to find her sitting by the fire, meticulously sewing a patch onto the knee of his work trousers. The stitches were small and perfect, a skill that seemed at odds with the hardship etched on her face. He watched her for a moment, unseen, a strange feeling tightening his chest. It had been years since anyone had performed such a simple, domestic act for him. She had an innate knowledge of the land that was different from his own, where he saw endless stretches of sagebrush. She saw a larder and a medicine chest. She would walk near the cabin, her movements still slow, and return with handfuls of greens for their stew or roots that she would boil into a bitter but healing tea. She was showing him that the land he saw as his enemy and his prison could also be a provider, a healer. The true shift between them came nearly a week after her arrival. His best mare, a beautiful buckskin named Dusty, had fallen ill. She was listless, refusing food, her coat dull and her breathing shallow. Elias knew the signs of colic, but this was something else. A sickness was moving through the territory, one the old-timers called the shivers. It was often fatal. The nearest veterinarian was in Redemption, a full day's ride away, and likely would not come for a single animal on a poor rancher's homestead. Elias felt a familiar, cold dread creeping in. He could not lose this horse. Lena found him in the corral, standing helplessly beside the suffering animal. She looked at the mare for a long time, her dark eyes observant. She ran a hand over the horse's neck, feeling the heat of the fever. She looked at its gums. "There is a root," she said quietly. "It grows near the water, with broad leaves and small yellow flowers, and I need the inner bark of the willow tree." He looked at her, skepticism warring with desperation. "What for?" "A poultice, for the fever, and a tea to make her drink. It is what my mother's people used." He had no other options. He led her down to the creek, and she pointed out the plants she needed. They spent the next hour gathering them. Back at the cabin, she worked with a focused intensity, crushing the roots into a paste and boiling the willow bark. She fashioned a poultice, hot and steaming, and showed Elias how to apply it to the mare's chest and throat. Then, with infinite patience, she coaxed the sick horse to drink the bitter tea. They stayed with the mare through the night, taking turns replacing the poultice and offering the tea. By morning, the fever had broken. The mare was standing on her own, weakly nuzzling Elias's hand for the first time in 2 days. Elias stood beside Lena, watching the horse drink deeply from the water trough. He could not find the words to thank her, but as he looked at her, he saw her not as a fragile creature he had rescued from a storm, but as a woman of incredible strength, a woman who possessed a deep and profound wisdom. The act had earned his complete and unspoken respect. The dynamic between them had irrevocably changed. Their interactions found a new ease after that. They shared quiet meals, the silence between them no longer a wall, but a comfortable space. It was a silence that did not need to be filled. He found himself speaking more than he had in 5 years, telling her about the land, the habits of the deer, the personalities of his different horses. He taught her how to handle his rifle, showing her how to brace it against her shoulder, how to lead a moving target, how to breathe out slow before squeezing the trigger. She, in turn, showed him how to find water by watching the flight of birds or by recognizing the specific plants that only grew where moisture was close to the surface. They were 2 halves of a whole. their skills a perfect complement to one another. He was the strength, she was the wisdom. He was the fist, she was the heart. He never spoke of Sarah or Daniel. The wound was too deep, too sacred to be exposed. But Lena could feel the presence of a great loss in him, a hollowness that no amount of work could fill. In the same way, he could sense the deep, abiding fear that lived just beneath her calm surface. A fragile, unspoken trust was being built between them, a bridge across their respective solitudes. The peace, like all things in that harsh land, was temporary. The crisis arrived without warning. Lena's arm, which had seemed to be healing well, became red and swollen around the old wound. She tried to hide it from him, but he saw her wince when she lifted a heavy pot. That night, a violent fever took hold of her. She was burning up, her body shaking with chills, her mind lost to delirium. The area around the gash was now streaked with angry red lines, a clear sign of blood poisoning. Elias felt a cold panic grip him. He knew, with a terrible certainty, that something was deeply wrong. He carefully unwrapped the bandage. The flesh was hot and angry, and at the center of the wound, he could see something dark just beneath the skin. It was not healing. It was festering from the inside out. He realized with dawning horror what must have happened. Some foreign object must have been driven into her arm when she was injured, and now it was poisoning her system. If he did not get it out, she would die. Sepsis would claim her just as the blizzard had claimed Sarah. There was no doctor. There was no time to fetch one. Redemption was a world away, and she would not last the journey, even if he could make it. He was her only hope. The thought was terrifying. He was a rancher, a breaker of horses, not a surgeon. His hands were made for force, not finesse. He took a long, steadying breath, the air burning in his lungs. He laid out his tools on the clean planked table, his sharpest skinning knife, its edge honed to a razor's keenness, a bottle of whiskey he kept for the coldest nights, a clean rag, and a thick strap of leather from a broken harness. The preparations were grim, methodical. He knelt beside the bed. Lena's eyes fluttered open. They were clouded with fever, but in their depths, he saw a flicker of lucid terror. She understood what he was about to do. "Lena," he said, his voice a low gravel. "There's something in your arm. I have to get it out." Tears welled in her eyes, born of fear and pain. "No," she whispered. "You will die if I do not," he said, the words stark and brutal. "I will not let that happen." He poured whiskey over the knife, the sharp scent of alcohol filling the small cabin. He poured a little onto the rag and cleaned the skin around the wound, her sharp hiss of pain cutting through him. He offered her the bottle. "Drink this." She shook her head, her teeth chattering. He put the leather strap between her teeth. "Bite on this. Bite down hard." She looked up at him, her eyes wide, a universe of fear and a desperate plea within them. She was putting her life, what little of it she had fought so hard to save, completely and totally into his hands. His own hands, usually so steady with a rope or a rein, trembled slightly. He took another breath and made the first cut, opening the wound wider. A scream, muffled by the leather, tore from her throat. Her whole body arched in agony. She thrashed on the bed, her legs kicking, her good arm flailing. "Hold still, Lena," he gritted out, his voice tight with strain. "For God's sake, you have to hold still." He had to probe the wound with the tip of the knife, searching for the object. The pain was excruciating for her, unimaginable. Tears streamed down her face, soaking the pillow. Her thrashing grew more violent. He knew he was close to losing control, close to failing her, in a moment of pure, desperate agony. Her wild eyes found his. She stopped fighting for a split second, her gaze locking with his. A silent communication passing between them that was more profound than any words they had ever shared. She spat the leather strap from her mouth. Her voice was a raw, broken gasp. each word an agony. "Go deeper! Make it quick inside!" It was a plea for him to be ruthless in order to save her. It was an act of ultimate surrender, of absolute and terrifying faith in him. Her words were like a pail of cold water, shocking him out of his hesitation. They galvanized him. The trembling in his hands ceased. His focus narrowed to the single, bloody point of his task. He became the instrument of her will. His hand steadied. He made the final, deep cut. The tip of his knife grated against something hard. With a surgeon's precision he never knew he possessed. He worked the object loose and pulled it free. It was a shard of black, glistening obsidian, a sliver from an old arrowhead. The tension in the room snapped. He dropped the knife and the bloody shard onto the floor, his strength giving out. He collapsed onto the edge of the bed beside her, his body shaking, emotionally and physically drained. Lena gave a final, shuddering sigh and finally succumbed to an exhausted, healing sleep. The moment, born of unimaginable pain and desperate trust, had forged a bond between them stronger than iron. It was a profound, non-sexual intimacy that had stripped them both bare, leaving only pure, desperate reliance on one another. He had held her life in his hands, and she had trusted him with it. Nothing would ever be the same. In the quiet aftermath of the fever and the knife, a new kind of silence settled in the cabin. The harrowing ordeal had burned away the cautious distance between them, leaving in its place a deep, unspoken intimacy. The space that had once separated them as strangers was now filled with the shared memory of pain, fear, and ultimate trust. Lena's recovery was slow, a gradual reclaiming of strength, and during that time Elias became her unwavering caretaker. A tenderness he did not know he possessed emerged from the depths of his grief. He would change the dressing on her arm with hands that had learned a new gentleness, his touch careful and sure. He spoon-fed her broth, his large frame hunched over the cot in a posture of profound concentration, as if this simple act held the weight of the world. In the long, quiet afternoons, when the sun slanted through the single window, he would sit beside her and read aloud. The book was an old, worn copy of Shakespeare, its leather cover cracked and its pages softened by time. It was the last relic of his late wife's life, a remnant of an education and a world far removed from the harsh realities of the Hollow. He had not opened it in 5 years. Now, his voice, low and steady, filled the cabin with the stories of kings and lovers, of tragedy and poetry. He read the words for Lena, but in doing so, he was unknowingly building a bridge back to his own buried heart. Lena, for her part, allowed herself to be vulnerable. It was a state she had spent her entire life avoiding, a luxury she could never afford. To be helpless had always meant to be in danger, but in Elias's quiet, steadfast care, she found a safety she had never known. She would watch him as he moved about the cabin, his presence a solid, reassuring constant. She saw past the grieving recluse, past the hard shell he presented to the world, and saw the man beneath, a man of profound goodness, whose gentleness was not a weakness but a deeply held strength. As her strength returned, Lena began to pour her own life back into the Hollow. She could not abide being idle. One morning, Elias found her on her knees by the side of the cabin, using a sharpened stick to turn over the hard-packed earth. She was planting a garden. It was a small, hopeful patch of dirt where she sowed seeds for herbs and vegetables, some saved from her journey, others found in a forgotten corner of the cabin. Soon, a splash of vibrant green defied the dusty brown landscape, a testament to her resilient spirit. She took over the cooking, and the cabin was transformed. For the first time in years, the air filled with the smells of real food, stew seasoned with wild herbs, bread baked in a skillet over the fire. While she worked, she would hum, the melodies soft and wistful. They were old folk songs from her childhood, songs her mother had sung to her in a language that was a mix of Spanish and Apache. The quiet, melodic sounds penetrated the walls Elias had built around his heart, chipping away at the stone. He found himself smiling sometimes, a strange and almost painful sensation. The muscles of his face stiff from disuse. The hollow, once a tomb for his memories, was slowly, tentatively, becoming a home again. Their romance blossomed not in grand declarations, but in the small, quiet moments that defined their new life together. It was in the way he would return from checking his fence lines and silently place a single, vibrant purple wildflower on the table for her. It was in the way she would take his torn work shirt and mend it with her fine, neat stitches before he even had a chance to notice the rip. They were small acts of caring, a language of devotion spoken without words. One evening, they sat on the porch step, watching the sunset bleed across the vast sky in fiery bands of orange, pink, and gold. The beauty of it was so profound it ached. In the gathering twilight, a new kind of quiet settled between them, one that invited confession. It was Lena who spoke first, her voice soft against the whisper of the wind. She told him everything. She spoke of Vicente, of his cloying possessiveness that masqueraded as kindness, of the gilded cage her life had been. She told him of the final, brutal escape, and of the constant, gnawing fear of being hunted, of always looking over her shoulder, of never truly being safe. When she finished, her story hung in the air between them, a fragile, painful offering. Elias sat in silence for a long time, his gaze fixed on the first stars beginning to prick the darkening sky. Then, in a halting, choked voice that sounded as if it were being torn from his throat, he told her about Sarah. He spoke her name aloud to another person for the first time in 5 years, and the sound of it was both a relief and an agony. He told her about their dreams for the hollow, about her laughter, about the brutal winter blizzard. And then he spoke the name of his son, Daniel, a name he had barely had the chance to use. They shared their deepest tragedies under the nascent stars, laying their broken pieces out before one another. In that shared vulnerability, in the raw and honest telling of their pain, their love was confessed. It was not a passionate declaration, but a simple, profound joining of hands in the darkness, his calloused fingers wrapped around hers, a silent promise of understanding, of acceptance, of shared solace. He turned to her, and in the dim light, he could see the glint of tears on her cheeks. Mirroring the ones in his own eyes, he leaned in and kissed her. It was a tentative, gentle kiss, not of wild passion, but of deep, healing tenderness. It was a kiss that tasted of salt and sorrow, but it promised a future. Their idyllic sanctuary, forged in trauma and sealed in trust, was a fragile thing in a harsh world. It was not long before that world began to intrude. Word travels fast in sparse country, carried by lonely riders and gossiping tongues in the saloons of redemption. The story that reached town was a twisted, ugly version of the truth. The cursed recluse Elias Thorne had taken up with a half-breed woman of unknown origin. Jedediah Kane saw his opportunity. He had been nursing a grudge since Elias had refused his offer, and this new development was a perfect weapon. He and his men began to fan the flames of prejudice that always simmered just beneath the surface of frontier society. Kane's version of the story painted Elias not just as a fool, but as a man who consorted with savages, who defied the unwritten social order that kept white men on top. Lena's mixed heritage, the very thing that gave her such strength and wisdom, was twisted into something dirty and dangerous. The theme of social prejudice, once a distant shadow in Lena's past, now became a powerful, oppressive force bearing down on their small hollow. The harassment began subtly. The next time Elias rode into Redemption for supplies, the change was palpable. He was met not with the grudging civility of before, but with cold shoulders and suspicious stares. Men on the boardwalk would stop talking as he passed. Mr. Henderson, the owner of the general store who had once been friendly enough, was now curt and distant, his eyes refusing to meet Elias's. At the saloon, where he stopped for a single whiskey to wash the trail dust from his throat, he heard the muttered slurs just loud enough to be meant for him. Elias felt a cold anger settle in his gut. His protective instincts, once dormant and directed only at the memory of his lost family, were now fiercely engaged and aimed at the present. He stood a little taller, his gaze a little harder. His hand, as if of its own accord, never strayed far from the worn wooden handle of the Colt on his hip. He was no longer just a man defending a piece of land. He was a man defending the honor of the woman he loved, and their right to simply exist. Cain's tactics, predictably, escalated. The subtle campaign of whispers and glares gave way to direct action. Elias rode out one morning to find a 100-yard section of his northern fence cut, the wires snipped and the posts kicked down. A dozen of his best cattle had been driven off in the night, their tracks mingling with those of several shod horses heading straight toward K-Bar territory. There was no proof, but he knew it was a message. A few days later, he went to draw water from his secondary well, one he used for the livestock, and was met with a foul, black stench. The water was poisoned, the surface shimmering with a greasy film. Thrown into the middle of it was the carcass of a coyote, its body bloated and grotesque. It was another warning, a promise of corruption and death. The most sinister act came a week after that. He was riding back to the cabin at dusk when he saw something hanging from the crossbeam of his main gate. As he drew closer, a chill ran down his spine. It was a crude doll, fashioned from corn husks. It had been dressed in a scrap of dark fabric, and strands of black horsehair had been glued to its head. A tiny leather cord was tied around its neck, a miniature noose, and the doll was left to swing in the evening breeze. The message was clear, vicious, and directed squarely at Lena. This constant, escalating pressure was meant to break them, to drive a wedge of fear and resentment between them. Instead, it did the opposite. It fused them together, solidifying their bond with the heat of shared adversity. Lena, though he could see the flicker of fear in her eyes when he showed her the doll, showed no weakness. She had faced the ugliness of prejudice her entire life. She would not be broken by it now. Her fear was tempered by a lifetime of defiance. "They want me to run," she said to him that night, her voice quiet but firm as steel. "I have been running my whole life. I will not run from this place. This is our home." She became his partner in fortifying the ranch. The woman who had healed his horse now learned to handle a rifle with deadly accuracy. He would set up tin cans on a fence post, and she would practice for hours, until she could hit them consistently at 50 yards. Her small frame was surprisingly steady, her eyes sharp and true. They worked together, their days now a mix of ranch work and constant vigilance. They kept watch in shifts through the night, one of them always awake, always listening. The violent intrusion of the world's hatred had shattered the fragile peace they had built. Their love story was no longer just about healing the wounds of the past. It was now a desperate fight for survival against a present and very real evil. The hollow, once their sanctuary, had become their fortress. Late one afternoon, Elias stood on the rise near the corral, watching Lena from a distance. She was in her small garden, her back to him, tending to the rows of green shoots that were her stubborn claim on the future. The setting sun caught the line of her shoulders, her back straight and defiant against the vast, empty landscape. She was not a victim. She was a survivor, a warrior in her own right. In that moment, he felt a surge of love for her so fierce it was a physical pain in his chest. It was a love that was equal parts tenderness and raw, protective rage. He had lost a family to this unforgiving land once before. He would not lose another. He realized, with a clarity that was both terrifying and absolute, that he would burn the entire world to the ground to keep her safe. The grieving man was gone, and a protector had taken his place. The moon was a buried coin, a forgotten sliver of light hidden behind a thick shroud of cloud. The night was a starless, suffocating blackness, the kind that swallows sound and smothers the senses. It was under this perfect cover of darkness that Jedediah Cain and his men rode on Thorn Creek Hollow. There were a dozen of them, including the hulking, brutal form of Riggs, their faces set in grim lines, their purpose a cold, hard knot of violence. Cain's rage, stoked by Elias's defiance and the failure of his campaign of intimidation, had curdled into a singular, destructive need. This was not a raid to steal cattle. It was an act of annihilation. They moved with the quiet efficiency of wolves, dismounting a quarter-mile from the cabin and approaching on foot. The attack began not with a gunshot, but with the hungry whoosh of fire. Two men, their arms arcing in the darkness, threw pitch-soaked torches onto the roof of the barn. The dry timber and the hay packed inside erupted in a terrifying inferno, the flames clawing instantly toward the black sky. The sound tore Elias from a shallow, restless sleep. It was a sound of pure horror, the high, panicked screaming of horses and the terrified bellows of cattle trapped in the roaring blaze. He was out of his cot in an instant, his mind snapping from sleep to a state of cold, sharp clarity. He grabbed his Winchester from the wall. Lena was already awake, her eyes wide with terror in the flickering, hellish light that now filled the cabin. "Get to the root cellar," he commanded, his voice a low, urgent growl. He grabbed her arm, his grip hard, and shoved her toward the trap door hidden beneath a bearskin rug. "Get in and bolt it from the inside. Do not open it. Do not make a sound, no matter what you hear. Do you understand me?" She was terrified, but her spirit, forged in a lifetime of survival, did not break. She nodded, her jaw tight, a silent promise passing between them. He watched her disappear into the darkness below, heard the heavy wooden bolt slide into place, and then he turned to face the end of his world. He burst through the cabin door, a lone figure against a dozen armed men, the burning barn casting his long, defiant shadow across the yard. The fight was a brutal, hopeless affair. Elias was a skilled and determined fighter, but he was one man against a tide of violence. He dropped to one knee behind the water trough, the Winchester firm against his shoulder. His first shot caught a man silhouetted against the fire, sending him sprawling into the dirt. His second found its mark in the shoulder of another, who screamed and staggered back into the darkness. But there were too many of them. They fanned out, their pistols spitting fire, the bullets thudding into the logs of the cabin and splintering the trough beside him. He was reloading, his fingers working with frantic precision, when a massive shape loomed out of the darkness behind him. It was Riggs. Elias sensed the movement a second too late. He tried to turn, to bring his rifle to bear, but the foreman swung his own rifle like a club. The heavy wooden stock connected with the side of Elias's head with a sickening crack. The world exploded in a flash of white-hot pain. And then there was nothing but the dirt rushing up to meet him. They descended upon him like vultures. Their boots and fists were a merciless storm, each blow a new, sharp agony. A kick to his ribs sent a spear of fire through his chest. A boot to his face split his lip and broke his nose. He felt his arm snap under a heavy stomp, the bone giving way with a wet, grinding sound. They were not trying to subdue him. They were trying to unmake him, to beat the very life and spirit out of his body, to leave nothing but a broken heap of flesh and bone. Through a haze of blood and pain, he saw Jedediah Cain step forward, a thin cigarillo glowing like a malevolent red eye in the dark. Cain stood over him, looking down with an expression of pure, triumphant contempt. He took a long drag from his cigarillo and blew the smoke down at Elias's battered face. "The land is mine now. Thorn!" Cain sneered, his voice a low, satisfied purr. "The curse is finally fulfilled." He turned and walked away without a backward glance. His men gave Elias one last, vicious kick for good measure before following their boss, their triumphant, ugly laughter echoing in the night. They left him for dead in the dirt, the roar of the burning barn the only sound in their wake, its hellish glow casting dancing, monstrous shadows on the scene of destruction. From the narrow cracks of the root cellar door, Lena witnessed it all. She was a prisoner in the dark, her mind screaming, her body frozen with a terror so absolute it was paralyzing. She had seen the impossible odds, had heard the gunshots, had watched in silent, soul-shattering horror as they had beaten the man she loved into a bloody, unmoving ruin. Her survival instincts, honed by a lifetime of hiding from men like these, kept her silent, her hand clamped over her own mouth to stifle the sobs that threatened to betray her. She remained there in the suffocating darkness, listening. She heard their laughter, the cruel, victorious sound fading as they rode away. Then, the only sound was the hungry crackle and roar of the fire as it consumed the barn, the heart of their small ranch. She did not know how long she waited. It could have been minutes or an eternity. Finally, when the silence stretched, broken only by the fire, she slid the heavy bolt back. Pushing the trap door open, she emerged into a nightmare. The air was thick with the acrid smoke of burning hay and wood, and the sickening smell of cooked meat. The barn was gone, reduced to a black, skeletal frame that clawed at the sky, spitting embers into the darkness. Her small, hopeful garden was a trampled ruin, the green shoots crushed into the mud. The bodies of their livestock, the few that had not been in the barn, were scattered across the yard where they had been shot. And in the center of it all, illuminated by the dying flames, was Elias. He was a still, bloody heap, so broken and unmoving that for a terrifying moment, she thought Cain's words were true, that the curse had finally won. In that moment, something inside Lena shifted. The fear she had lived with her entire life, the fear that had been her constant companion, gave way to something else, something ferocious and primal. The woman who had been a victim, who had spent her life running and hiding, was gone. In her place stood a savior. Tears streamed down her face, mixing with the soot and grime, but her movements were driven by a fierce, newfound strength. Praying to a God she was not sure she believed in, she scrambled to his side. She knelt in the bloody mud and pressed her trembling fingers to his neck. For a heart-stopping second, she felt nothing. Then, beneath her fingertips, a flutter. It was faint, thready, but it was there. A pulse. He was alive. A wave of relief so powerful it was nauseating washed over her. But it was followed immediately by a new, urgent fear. She could not leave him here. She could not move him to the cabin. Cain's men might return to admire their handiwork, to finish the job. Her mind, racing, latched onto a memory. A few weeks ago, Elias had shown her a small cave, hidden in the hills behind a veil of water from a spring-fed waterfall. "If you ever need a place to disappear," he had told her, "this is it." The sequence that followed was a grueling testament to her will. She could not carry him. He was a dead weight, far too heavy for her. She ran to the wreckage of the porch, finding 2 long, sturdy poles from the broken railing. She retrieved the thick wool blanket from his cot in the cabin. Working with a desperate, frantic energy, she fashioned a crude travois, lashing the blanket between the 2 poles with strips of leather she cut from a saddle harness. Rolling his unconscious body onto the blanket was an agony of effort. He was so limp, so broken, with every movement. A low groan of pain escaped his lips, a sound that tore at her heart. Finally, he was secure. She took the front ends of the poles in her hands, her knuckles white, and began to pull. Every step was a battle. She hauled his dead weight across the rough, uneven ground, her muscles screaming in protest, her lungs burning. The terrain fought her, the rocks and roots catching at the poles, threatening to stop her cold. Fear was a constant companion. The fear of discovery, the fear that she was hurting him more, the fear that he would die before she could get him to safety. But her resolve was unbreakable. With superhuman effort, fueled by love and a ferocious will to live, she dragged him away from the ruin of their home, up into the dark hills. She finally reached the cave as the first, pale light of dawn began to touch the eastern sky. It was a small, defensible shelter, its entrance hidden by a curtain of falling water. She pulled the travois inside, into the damp, cold dark, and collapsed, her body shaking with exhaustion, her strength utterly spent. The roles were now completely reversed. The woman he had saved from the storm had now saved him from certain death. She was the protector. She was the healer. In the damp chill of the cave, she began the painstaking work of tending to his horrific injuries. She built a small, smokeless fire deep inside the cave, its flickering light a small comfort against the overwhelming darkness. She tore her own dress into strips, soaking them in the clean, cold water of the spring to gently clean the blood and grime from his wounds. She found a deep gash on his scalp, a collection of broken ribs that made every breath a shallow, painful rasp, and his left arm, which was bent at an unnatural angle. With a grim determination, she set the broken bone. She found 2 straight, sturdy branches and patted them with moss, then pulled the bone into place, a choked sob escaping her as she heard the faint grating sound. She bound the splint tightly with more strips of her dress. She gathered herbs she recognized from the hills around the cave, chewing them into a poultice to pack into his open wounds to stave off infection, just as her mother had taught her. For days, he was lost to the world. He drifted in a delirium of pain and fever, muttering names that were ghosts from his past. He called out for Sarah, his voice thick with a sorrow that was 5 years old. Then, his broken mind would drift to the present, and he would murmur her name. Lena. She never left his side. Her exhaustion was absolute, a heavy, leaden weight on her soul. But her resolve was a diamond, hard and unbreakable. He finally regained consciousness on the 4th day. His eyes fluttered open, confused at first, then slowly focusing on her face in the flickering firelight. The true weight of what they had lost settled upon them in the silence of the cave. Everything they had built, the small, fragile life they had started to nurture, was gone. The barn, the animals, her garden, the cabin itself. They had nothing left but the clothes on their backs and each other. He tried to sit up, a sharp groan of pain stopping him. "Cain," he rasped, his voice a dry whisper. "He is gone, Elias," she said softly, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "We are safe here." He looked at his splinted arm, at her exhausted, soot-stained face, at the cold, damp walls of their refuge. Despair, darker and more profound than any he had ever known, washed over him. His body was broken, but it was his spirit that was shattered. "The curse," he whispered, his eyes closing. "It is real. I brought this on you. Lena, I brought you into this, and it has destroyed you, too." She saw the despair in his eyes, the deep, soul-crushing belief that he was a harbinger of tragedy, and a fierce love rose up in her, a shield against his darkness. She knelt beside him, her face close to his, her gaze intense. "You are not a curse, Elias," she said, her voice raw and shaking with emotion, but absolutely firm. "Do you hear me? You are the only good thing that has ever happened to me. Vicente, the men who hunted me, that was destruction. You are life." She took his good hand in both of hers, her grip tight, willing him to feel her conviction. "Look at us. He did not kill us. They left us for dead, but we are alive. That is what matters. We are alive, and we are together." In that dark, desolate cave, surrounded by the ruins of their life, her words were not just a comfort, they were a weapon, they were a promise. Their love, forged in pain and tested by fire, became their only reason to keep fighting. Hope was a tiny, flickering ember in an overwhelming darkness, but with her hand in his, it did not go out. Time in the hidden cave lost its sharp edges, the days bleeding into weeks, marked only by the slow crawl of the sun across the sliver of sky visible through the waterfall. They lived a primal, stripped-down existence, a life measured in heartbeats and survival. Lena was their anchor to the living world. She moved through the rugged landscape with a quiet grace, her Apache mother's knowledge flowing through her veins. She set snares that yielded rabbits for their pot, their small bodies a precious gift of sustenance. She would stand for hours in the cold creek that fed the waterfall, her hands patient and swift, catching fish that she would cook over their small, carefully hidden fire. She foraged for roots and berries and healing herbs, her knowledge of the land keeping them both alive. While Lena provided for their bodies, Elias fought a war within his soul. His broken bones slowly, painfully, began to knit themselves back together. His ribs still ached with every breath, and his arm was a clumsy, weak thing. But his physical strength was returning. His spirit, however, remained a shattered ruin. He was consumed by a cold, simmering rage that was a constant fire in his belly. It was a rage at Cain, at the world, and most of all, at himself. He would watch Lena as she worked, her movements efficient and tireless, and a profound sense of failure would wash over him. This incredible woman, who had saved his life with her bare hands and sheer force of will, was now living like a fugitive in a damp cave because of him. The guilt was a heavier burden than any of his physical injuries, a poison that seeped into his waking thoughts and haunted his dreams. A profound shift was occurring within him. The fire of Cain's attack had burned away the quiet, grieving man he had been. The sorrow that had defined him for 5 long years was incinerated, and what was left in its place was something harder, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. The simple desire for a peaceful life, for a home and a future, was gone, replaced by an all-consuming need for justice, or perhaps, he admitted to himself in the darkest hours of the night, it was vengeance. He knew with a cold certainty that he would find no help in the town of redemption. The law was a commodity, and Jedediah Cain owned all of it, from the sheriff on his payroll to the judges who enjoyed his whiskey. No one would listen to the word of a ruined, half-dead rancher and a woman they had already dismissed as a half-breed. To defeat Cain, to get any measure of justice for what had been done to them, he would have to operate outside the law. He would have to become a ghost. As his strength returned, Elias began to train, pushing his broken body to its absolute limits. He would climb the rock faces around the cave until his muscles screamed and his fingers were raw. He practiced with his knife, his movements becoming swift and silent. He took his recovered Winchester and spent hours in a secluded canyon, firing at targets, reacquainting himself with the cold, deadly calculus of ballistics. He became a phantom of the territory, a whisper in the canyons, using his intimate knowledge of the rugged landscape as his greatest weapon. His campaign against Cain was methodical, a slow and strategic bleeding of his enemy. He did not engage in open warfare. That would be suicide. Instead, he became a persistent, debilitating nuisance, a curse far more real than the one the gossips whispered about. He knew the land, every game trail, every hidden spring, every treacherous pass. He used that knowledge. He found a narrow canyon pass that Cain used as a shortcut for his cattle drives and spent 2 days painstakingly loosening the rocks on the cliff above. When the next K-bar drive came through, a single well-aimed rifle shot from a half-mile away brought half the cliff face down, a thundering rock slide that blocked the pass completely. The detour would cost Cain a week of time and hundreds of dollars in lost weight on his cattle. He used his skills with horses, the one art he had ever truly loved, as another weapon. He found where Cain kept his prize studs, a dozen magnificent animals in a remote, well-watered pasture, over the course of 3 nights, using a gentle mare as a lure. He drew them away, one by one, scattering them to the 4 winds in the wild country where they would never be found. He left unsettling signs at Cain's remote line shacks, the small cabins where his ranch hands lived for weeks at a time, a dead snake laid carefully on a pillow, tools rearranged in a bizarre pattern, a single, dark feather, one he had asked Lena for, tucked into a door jamb. They were the same kind of unnerving warnings Cain had used against him, designed to create fear and dissent, to make Cain's own men feel watched and unsafe on their own land. During this time, Elias knew he needed allies. He was a ghost, but a ghost could not fight a war alone. He sought out the Miller family, the homesteaders he had once quietly helped. He found their small sod house under the cover of darkness, a lone figure emerging from the night. At first, they were terrified, but when they recognized him, their fear gave way to a grim sympathy. They, too, had been squeezed by Cain's relentless land grab, their water rights threatened, their small herd harassed by K-Bar riders. The story of what had happened at Thorn Creek Hollow had spread, a grim cautionary tale. At great risk to themselves, they agreed to help. Mr. Miller would listen for news in town, passing along information about Cain's plans. Mrs. Miller would leave supplies for him, a sack of beans, a box of cartridges, at a designated drop point. His most unlikely ally came in the form of a young man named Billy. Elias found him sleeping in a livery stable in a town 50 miles from Redemption. A thin blanket pulled over a body that was covered in fresh bruises. Billy was barely 20, with an honest face and a deep-seated anger in his eyes. He had been a K-Bar ranch hand until a week ago. He told Elias the story in a low, bitter voice. He had spoken up when Riggs had been beating a horse half to death. For his trouble, Riggs had fired him and then given him a brutal beating of his own, warning him to never show his face in the territory again. The young man had a conscience, a rare and dangerous thing in Cain's world, and he hated what Jedediah Cain stood for. Billy became Elias's eyes and ears inside the K-Bar empire. He knew the ranch's operations, the schedules of the patrols, the weaknesses in its security. Most importantly, he knew about Cain's criminal dealings. He keeps a ledger, Billy told Elias one night, their faces illuminated by a small, shielded fire in a deep arroyo. A private one. Details every head of cattle he has rustled over the years. Who he bought them from, who he sold them to. He keeps it in the safe in his office. Through this dark and dangerous transformation, Lena was his anchor. She watched him, her heart aching, as the quiet, gentle man she had fallen in love with was overlaid by this new, harder persona. She saw the cold light in his eyes and worried that his quest for justice would consume him, that in his fight against the monster, he would become one himself. Their love, born in desperation, was now tested by the secrecy and danger of his new life. There were tense, whispered arguments in the damp confines of the cave. She would plead with him, her voice a mixture of love and fear, not to lose himself to the hatred that was driving him. "This is not who you are, Elias," she told him fiercely one night, grabbing his arm as he prepared to slip out into the darkness. "I did not save the man to lose the soul." He would listen, his face a hard, unreadable mask, but her words found their mark. Her voice became his moral compass, a constant reminder in the back of his mind that the goal was justice, not just a blind and bloody revenge. Their moments of passion were no longer gentle and healing. They were fierce, desperate, shadowed by the constant threat of discovery and death, a clinging to life and to each other in a world that wanted them both erased. The climax of their shadow war arrived with a piece of information from Billy that changed everything. He met Elias at a remote line shack with news that made the blood run cold in Elias's veins. "It is not just the ledger, Elias," Billy whispered, his eyes wide with the gravity of his discovery. "I overheard Cain talking to Riggs. There is a letter in that safe. It is from a man in New Mexico, a patron named Vicente." Elias's body went rigid. "The letter confirms their partnership," Billy continued, unaware of the name's full significance. "Cain was supposed to help him track down some woman who ran away from him. The letter says Cain's payment would be delivered once the woman was retired." The word hung in the air, cold and final. It was no longer just about land, or cattle, or even the destruction of his home. Cain had conspired to hunt and murder Lena. The fight was now infinitely more personal. He had to get that letter. The plan was audacious, bordering on suicidal. Billy informed him that Cain was hosting a large party for prospective cattle buyers from back east. The ranch house would be full of people, music and whiskey. Security would be focused on the guests. not on a quiet infiltration of Kane's private office. It was his only chance. The night of the party. Elias moved like a phantom. He was dressed in dark clothes, his face darkened with soot. He slipped through the outer perimeter of the K-Bar ranch, his movements silent and sure. He reached the main house, a grand, sprawling structure that was ablaze with light and ringing with the sounds of laughter and a poorly played piano. He scaled a trellis onto a second-floor balcony, slipping through an unlocked window into a guest bedroom. The house was a maze of hallways and unfamiliar rooms. He moved through it like a ghost, his heart pounding a steady, controlled rhythm. He finally reached Kane's office. The door was unlocked. Inside, the room smelled of leather, cigar smoke, and power. The safe, a large black iron box, stood against the far wall. He knelt before it, his tools laid out on a small cloth. This was a skill he had not used in over 15 years, a relic from a wilder, more reckless youth before he had met Sarah. His fingers, now calloused and scarred, remembered the delicate work. He listened to the faint clicks of the tumblers, his entire world narrowing to the sounds inside the lock. After what felt like an eternity, he heard the final, satisfying thud as the bolt released. Inside, he found it all. The ledger, its columns of numbers a testament to years of theft, and beneath it, a letter, written in a florid hand on expensive paper, the name Vicente signed at the bottom. He secured them inside his shirt, his mission complete. As he turned to leave, the office door swung open. Riggs stood there, his massive frame filling the doorway, a bottle of whiskey in one hand, his face slack with surprise that quickly hardened into a snarl of recognition. There was no time for words, no time for guns. Riggs lunged, and Elias met him, driving his shoulder into the big man's midsection. They crashed into the heavy oak desk, the impact sending an inkwell flying. A brutal, silent fight ensued. It was a desperate struggle of Elias's calculated skill against Riggs's brute force. The foreman's fists were like hammers, but he was slow and clumsy with drink. Elias was faster, fueled by the memory of the beating he had endured, his movements economical and deadly. He dodged a wild swing and drove his knee into Riggs's thigh, earning a grunt of pain. Riggs roared and grabbed him, his powerful hands closing around Elias's throat. Elias's vision began to swim in black spots. In desperation, he slammed the heel of his good hand up into Riggs's nose. There was a crunch of cartilage, and the big man screamed, his grip loosening as blood poured down his face. Elias broke free, but not before Riggs, in a final, desperate act, pulled a skinning knife from his belt and slashed wildly. The blade bit deep into Elias's side. A wave of searing pain shot through him, but adrenaline surged with it, ignoring the fire in his ribs. He grabbed a heavy glass paperweight from the desk and brought it down with all his force on the side of Riggs's head. The foreman's eyes rolled back, and he collapsed to the floor, unconscious. Elias staggered back, clutching his side, his shirt already warm and wet with his own blood. He could hear voices in the hallway, alerted by the commotion. There was no time. He scrambled out the window he had entered, dropping the 10 feet to the soft ground below. He ran, bleeding but triumphant, melting back into the darkness from which he came. The proof he needed to destroy Jedediah Kane clutched tightly in his hand. The long journey back to the cave was a blur of pain and determination. He pressed a wad of his shirt against the wound, his steps growing heavy, his vision tunneling. He finally stumbled through the waterfall, a ghost returning to his refuge, and collapsed into Lena's arms as she rushed to meet him, the ledger and the letter falling from his grasp onto the cave floor. Lena's hands were gentle but firm as she stitched the wound in his side, her movements practiced and sure. The knife cut was deep, a fiery line of pain that was a constant reminder of their victory and its cost. Wounded but armed with the truth, Elias lay on a bed of pine boughs in the cave, the stolen ledger and the damning letter laid out beside him. They were more than paper and ink. They were the weapons of their final war, the tools of a justice they would have to seize for themselves. Billy, his youthful face etched with a gravity beyond his years, was their connection to the outside world. He slipped into their hidden refuge a few days after the raid on the K-Bar, bringing not only food and bandages from the Millers, but a piece of vital information. "There is a territorial marshal coming to Redemption," he said, his voice a low, urgent whisper. "His name is Judge Blackwood. They say he is a hard man, follows federal law to the letter, and has no love for small-town sheriffs who line their own pockets. He is here to oversee the government auction of unbranded cattle. It is in 3 days. It is our only chance. Elias, it is the only time there will be an authority in town that Kane cannot control." The words settled in the quiet of the cave. A federal marshal. An auction that would bring cattlemen and officials from all over the territory. It was a stage, a public forum where Kane's power would be diluted by the presence of outsiders. It was an incredible, terrifying risk. They planned their final move around the flickering fire, their small band of allies united against a giant. The plan was twofold, a desperate gamble that relied on timing and courage. The Millers, along with 2 other homesteader families who had been pushed to the brink by Kane's greed, would create a diversion. A staged brawl would erupt at the far end of town, near the saloon, and a small, controlled fire would be set in an old, abandoned shed. The commotion, Billy reasoned, would be enough to draw away Sheriff Miller and the K-Bar men Kane always kept with him as personal guards. That would leave the town square, where the auction was being held, momentarily vulnerable. In that window of chaos, Elias would make his move. He would step out and publicly confront Kane in front of Marshal Blackwood and the assembled crowd. If it failed, they would all be dead before the sun set. The day of the auction dawned bright and clear, the Wyoming sky a pitiless, perfect blue. The town of Redemption was crowded, a sea of dusty hats and wagons. The air was thick with the smell of cattle, horse sweat, and nervous energy. Jedediah Kane was in his element. He stood on the steps of the land office, dressed in a fine black coat, holding court like a king. He was surrounded by wealthy cattle buyers, his laughter expansive and arrogant, his power absolute and on full display. Riggs stood just behind his right shoulder, a silent, brutish dog of war, his newly broken nose a testament to Elias's visit. Elias watched from the shadows of an alleyway across the square, the ledger and letter wrapped in oilcloth and tucked inside his shirt. His side was a dull, throbbing ache, but his mind was sharp, every sense honed to a razor's edge. He saw Lena standing near the general store, a simple shawl over her shoulders, her face calm and composed. She had insisted on being there. "This is my fight, too," she had told him, her voice leaving no room for argument. "I will not hide while you stand for me." Her presence was a quiet act of defiance, a statement that she would not be erased. Their eyes met across the crowded square. It was a look that lasted only a second, but it contained a lifetime of shared history, of pain and healing, of fear and love, and of a shared destiny that would be decided in the next few minutes. At precisely noon, a shout erupted from the far end of the street. Mr. Miller, a man of peace, threw a theatrical punch at another homesteader, and a wild brawl spilled out of the saloon doors. A moment later, a plume of thick black smoke began to rise from behind the livery stable. The crowd in the square stirred, their attention diverted. Sheriff Miller, his face a mask of annoyance, motioned to his deputies and half of Kane's men. "Go see to it," he barked, and they ran toward the commotion. The diversion was working. The net around Kane had been loosened. Now was the time. Elias took a deep breath and stepped out from the alleyway, into the harsh, bright sunlight of the town square. He walked with a purpose, his limp barely noticeable, his gaze locked on Jedediah Kane. "Jedediah Kane!" His voice was not a shout, but it rang across the suddenly quiet square with the clarity of a bell. Every head turned toward him. Kane, who had been in the middle of a joke, stopped, his smile freezing on his face. He saw Elias, and his expression shifted from surprise to a mixture of rage and amused contempt. "Well, look what the wind blew in," Cain said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Elias Thorne, I heard you had some trouble out at your place. Come to beg for a job." "I have come for justice," Elias said, his voice steady, his eyes cold. He took another step forward, into the center of the open space. "I accuse you, in front of these witnesses, of cattle rustling, of arson, and of the attempted murder of myself and the murder of 2 of your own men during your attack on my ranch." A collective gasp went through the crowd. The silence that followed was absolute. Cain let out a short, barking laugh, a performance for the men around him. "This is absurd. The man is crazed." His cursed land finally broke his mind. It was then that a new figure stepped forward. He was a grizzled, older man with a thick gray mustache and eyes as hard as granite. A silver star, identifying him as a territorial marshal, was pinned to his vest. "Those are serious accusations. Son," Judge Blackwood said, his voice a low rumble of authority. He looked from Elias to Cain, his expression unreadable. "You had best have more than just words." "I do," Elias said calmly. He reached into his shirt and produced the oilcloth packet. He unwrapped it and held up the ledger. "This is Jedediah Cain's private ledger. It details every head of cattle he has stolen in this territory for the past 5 years, including a dozen of my own." He then held up the single sheet of paper. "And this is a letter from a man named Vicente in New Mexico. It proves a conspiracy between him and Cain to hunt down and kill a woman. That woman is Lena Serrano, and she is standing right over there." He called out, "Billy!" from the edge of the crowd. The young man stepped forward, his face pale but his eyes resolute. "Tell the marshal what you told me." Billy, in a clear, unwavering voice, corroborated the story, giving a first-hand account of the corruption and violence he had witnessed as a K-Bar ranch hand. The final piece of the testimony was Lena herself. She stepped forward from the crowd, her head held high, her dignity a shield against the curious and hostile stares. She did not speak with anger, but with a powerful, quiet grace, her voice carrying across the square as she gave a dignified account of Cain's persecution, of the threats, of the doll hung from the gate. The evidence was overwhelming, the public testimony damning. Cain was exposed, his carefully constructed facade of respectability shattered in a matter of minutes. He panicked, his face, which had been a mask of arrogant amusement, contorted into a snarl of pure, feral rage. In a flash of movement, he drew his pistol, leveling it not at the marshal, but at the source of his ruin, Elias. "Elias, look out!" Billy screamed. In an act of selfless, instantaneous courage, the young man lunged, shoving Elias hard. The world seemed to move in slow motion. Cain's gun bucked, the explosion deafening in the stunned silence. Billy cried out, a sharp, surprised sound. As the bullet meant for Elias slammed into his chest, he staggered backward, a dark stain blossoming on his shirt. The gunshot broke the spell. Chaos erupted. Riggs and the remaining K-Bar men drew their weapons. Marshal Blackwood roared, "Federal Marshal, drop your weapons!" as he and his deputies drew their own guns. The town square became a maelstrom of shouting and gunfire. Elias pushed to the ground, rolled, and came up with his Colt in his hand. His mind was a block of ice, his actions precise and cold. He saw Riggs leveling a pistol at the marshal. He fired once. The bullet struck the gun in Riggs's hand, sending it spinning away, shattering the bones in his wrist. The big man howled in pain and collapsed to his knees. Elias did not fire again. He holstered his pistol and turned his attention to Cain. He confronted his enemy not with bullets, but with raw, physical force. He charged across the space between them, tackling Cain to the ground with the full force of his body. The fight was brief and brutal, a collision of hatred and desperation. It ended with Elias's fist connecting squarely with Cain's jaw. A single, sharp crack of bone and a final explosion of violence. Cain went limp. Justice, swift and violent, had been served. The marshal and his deputies quickly subdued the rest of Cain's men. The gunfight over almost as quickly as it had begun. The aftermath was somber and quiet. The noise of the fight was replaced by the sound of young Billy's ragged, failing breaths. "Mister." Miller cradled the boy in his arms, tears streaming down the homesteader's face. Elias knelt beside them, but there was nothing to be done. Billy looked up at him, a faint, bloody smile on his lips, and then his eyes went vacant. A tragic, heroic sacrifice had paid for their victory. Marshal Blackwood, his face a grim mask, personally shackled Jedediah Cain and his men, including the whimpering Riggs. "You will face a federal trial for your crimes," Blackwood promised, his voice cold as a winter grave. The townspeople, who had once shunned and whispered about Elias and Lena, now looked on with a mixture of awe and shame. They had witnessed true courage, had seen justice delivered not by a corrupt sheriff, but by the very people they had ostracized. Weeks later, Elias and Lena stood on the small hill overlooking Thorn Creek Hollow. The late afternoon sun cast a warm, golden light on the land. The ruins of their barn were a dark, ugly scar, a permanent reminder of the violence they had endured. But the land itself was already beginning to heal. Wildflowers were sprouting where her garden had been trampled. On the hill beside them, the two simple wooden crosses that marked the graves of Sarah and Daniel now had a third, freshly carved cross standing beside them. It simply read, "Billy, a good man." The curse, the shadow that had haunted this hollow and Elias's heart for so long, had been met and shattered. It was not defeated by magic or fate, but by love, by a resilience that refused to break, and by the simple, bloody-minded will to fight back for a life worth living. They had lost everything they had owned, yet they had gained everything that truly mattered. Elias turned to Lena. The harsh, grief-stricken lines on his face softened by a hope he never thought he would feel again. He reached out and gently touched her cheek. They were not starting over. The past could never be erased. They were starting anew. They walked down from the hill, hand in hand, toward the foundation of their burned-out cabin. The ashes had been cleared away, leaving only the bare stone and the promise of what could be. Elias stooped and picked up a hammer, its weight familiar and solid in his hand. Lena knelt and picked up a small, precious handful of seeds she had saved from her ravaged garden, a tiny, defiant promise of life. Together, under the vast, watchful sky of the American West, they began to rebuild. The ending was not a fairy tale. It was a testament to the enduring, stubborn power of the human spirit to find hope and build a future, even from the ashes of unspeakable tragedy. Their love was the foundation, stronger and more resilient than any log or stone. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment with where you are listening from to connect with others. Subscribe to our From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.